Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I've gotten back to running after a 6-week injury layoff, so that's helped me a little with the general depression, anxiety, lack of self-worth, etc. that I've prattled on about here. I'm taking it easy and easing back into things so I don't get hurt and have to go on the shelf for another stretch and, further lose my mind. Keep in mind, easy meant I ran a slow 6 miles or so with the guys in my running group after not being able to even stretch for a month plus. My body was sore for like 3 days, but in a good way. And then I went out for another 6 that Saturday and another 6 plus yesterday, gabbing with my pals a lot of the time. Well, the time that I wasn't, huffing and puffing because my wind is totally shot at this point. But anyway, it feels really good to get back to that. I even went with shorts yesterday in mid-20 degree weather because it was sunny and looked like it was getting into the 30s, and I'm insane. But the physicality, the getting out, the sociability thing, all of that is really, really, really important to me. So that is some of what's going on beyond work and podcastery. Speaking of, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is Nicole Rudick, who has a brand new book out, What Is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined, an autobiography of Nikki de Sanfal from Siglio Press. This is an amazing wonder of a book, illuminating an artist's life while also sparking the creative impulse in, a schlub like me. Now, Nikki, the artist, not Nicole, the podcast, Nikki was known for working in different forms, maybe best known for her paintings and sculptures that required being shot at by their viewers, where there were paint bags that would explode and further create the art. And anyway, it was an early 60s thing. She was also really known for these immense sculpture projects and her nanas, which are these big feminine figures. But beyond the big either canvas or sculptural fine art, Nicole uses another ongoing art form of Nikki's for this book, namely her word paintings, along with some of Nikki's letters from her archives, to let the artist reveal herself, both in sort of private correspondence and public work that's text-based but graphic and visual. And what makes it such a compelling book, besides the gorgeousness of the art itself, is that Nicole doesn't provide commentary beyond her introduction and afterword. The book itself, the main body of the book, just consists of these pieces of art and these letters from Nikki de Sanfal. And the work speaks for itself, letting Nikki tell her story through her art and her own words. Hence the auto in the autobiography of the subtitle. And in that subtitle, auto is in parentheses. And Nicole and I get into what that means as far as her role goes in selecting what goes in, organizing it, putting it together. Anyway, I do want to note that my entree into the work of Nikki de Sanfal really was the word paintings. That's the first thing I ever saw of hers, which was less than a year ago when I saw them come up in Laura Lindsted's novel, My Friend Natalia. At the time, I took it on faith that this fancy named artist who this character was fixated on and had recreated a word painting of actually existed and was not a fictional creation within Laura's novel, which was entirely feasible too. But I trusted, without looking Nikki de Sanfal up online, that she was real. Later on, I read a 2021 a review of her 2021 exhibition by New Yorker art critic Peter Sheldall, which led me to conclude that, yes, this artist was real and had this absolutely amazing career, where the word paintings are, almost secondary at the time, or at least in terms of what Sheldall was reviewing. Anyway, I guess that's part of why I was fascinated by Nicole's book and the sense of Nikki using visual words, art, I don't know how to describe it otherwise, but, written art to reveal and conceal herself while she was simultaneously making art in other forms. And she describes some of those other projects in her letters or in her other art, which conveys all you need to know about it. Nicole and I talk about why she didn't include photographs of the sculptures and other stuff, but it all makes sense when you actually see this book. And in Nikki's letters, we learn more of the costs of pursuing this life and how she left her children with her first husband, Harry Matthews, and how she dealt with or was dealt with by the art establishment, and how the materials she worked with were destroying her health, and maybe most pivotally, how she committed years of her life to building the Taro Garden, this grand sculpture garden in Tuscany. But beyond just the artistic vision of it, she goes into the work to raise the funds, to coordinate the workers, to stay physically safe in what became mafia territory, and more, that balances the artistic transcendent world with the imminent day-to-day one in which we all have to get by. Now, what is now known was once only imagined is a revelation into the artist's life, this particular artist and the artist collective. But it's also just flat out gorgeous to look at. The art reproductions are fantastic. The production quality is tops. The publisher, Siglio Press, has just made a perfect package for this project. It's out now, which is February 22nd, 2022 for you number-obsessed time travelers out there. So go check out What Is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined, an autobiography of Nikki de Saint Phalle by Nicole Rudick. And yes, we talk about what by means in our conversation. There's a couple more things. How I know Nicole. I first met her at the memorial I hosted in New York for Tom Spurgeon in early 2020. I'd seen Nicole's name come up before, and I'd seen her in the New York Review of Books, and I knew she was involved in the comics world, and she would go on to help put out the New York Review Comics reissue of Gary Panter's amazing book, Jimbo, and write the afterword for that. And we talk about that and her work with Gary a bit in this episode. Also, as funny stories go, we recorded this one in person, which is not the funny part. The funny part is, in a true sitcom-like level miscommunication, when we planned this out, neither of us explicitly said where we were going to record. So, at the appointed time, which was 11 a.m. on a Sunday, we each showed up at the other one's house. Once we figured out where we were, nobody was answering at her door. I didn't know if I had the right address. A neighbor came out, and I asked him if Nicole still lived there. And as he was calling her to find out where she was, my phone rang. It was my wife saying, Nicole's here? So I drove the 45 minutes back to my house so we could record there instead of having Nicole come back to her place, figuring that, maybe she just wanted maybe she would just enjoy ogling the books in my library and just doing the same thing I do when I go to someone else's house. I figured I would let her have that experience this time around. Next time, though, we're recording down at her place, and we will determine in advance that this is where we're going to record. Anyway, here's Nicole's bio from the book. There's a more extensive one at her site. Nicole Rudick is a critic and an editor. Her writing on art, literature, and comics has been published in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art Forum, and elsewhere. She was managing editor of the Paris Review for nearly a decade. She is the editor of a new edition of Gary Panter's legendary comic, Jimbo, Adventures in Paradise. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Nicole Rudick. tell me about the origin of the book. Tell me where it began for you, or tell me where your Nikki began.
I can't remember exactly where Nikki began. I say in the book that her name was in somebody else's history, and I grew up, looking at art and reading a lot, and so it was somewhere at some point, though I can't remember exactly when it was, and she just sort of stuck with me. I mean, I remember the buoyant colors and the women especially, and she was French, which I was in love with all things French. And she was just in the back of my mind for years and years, and I knew enough about her work that I, in the past, I don't know, not quite decade, but let's see, in the past several years, I knew I wanted to do a book that was a kind of autobiography, because I was familiar enough with her work that I knew that she had put her life, her biography into it. And so you could tell a story that way. And I proposed it to Lisa Pearson at Siglio. Mm-hmm. We had known each other for years, and I knew that she would get it, like no one else. And she immediately did. So I didn't have to write up any kind of proposal or anything like that. We just had lunch, and I said, I want to do this book, and this is what I'm thinking. And she said, yes. And
then you were in for it.
And then I was in for it. We were trying to remember exactly when that happened. It must have been maybe 2016, maybe a little bit before. But I'm also an epic procrastinator, so I didn't do anything about it for a little while. She would ask me periodically. But then in, 2017, when I was working at the Paris Review, we did an interview with Maxine Grofsky, who was the Paris editor of the Review in the 60s and 70s. And Maxine had been friends with Nikki in Paris, and we were introduced. And I told Maxine, I want to do a book about Nikki. And she thought it was a wonderful idea. And telling Maxine, I thought, I've told her, I have to do it now. Yeah. I can't disappoint her.
It made it real, and it made it a deadline.
It made it real. Yeah. And she introduced me to Bloom, who is part of the board who oversees the Nikki Charitable Art Foundation. So people knew about it. Once it was out, I had to do it. I could not do it. And so in 2019, I went to her archive in just outside San Diego and spent several days going through things, and came back with tons of stuff, more than I expected, and with a slightly different plan than I had originally.
Yeah, what was the original notion for this, and how did it change?
It was very similar to what the book is. I knew that I would use her work to tell the story, but I had always thought that I would interview people, interview her family members, people that she knew, to sort of flesh out the story a bit. But when I got to the archive, they had a binder full of interviews that they had done shortly after her death with, her friends and family and other people, where they had asked them about Nikki and what they remembered about her and how they knew her. And it was, it was all fascinating to read different people's takes on Nikki and their sort of suppositions about why she did the things she did, or what kind of person she was to them. And you see the differences that people see. So everybody had, as they would, everybody had a different version of Nikki. They had their own version of Nikki. And I realized that I didn't want that in there, that I just wanted her, because her voice in these works was so strong, and she was so clearly putting herself into these works for a purpose. So I decided to do none of that, and I just used her work to tell her story.
Which raises the question, are you editor, curator, author? Because it's a selection process, which you talk about somewhat, but what does that make your role in this book?
It's a little complicated.
Yeah.
I don't think of it as a curation, because I think it's a different process and a different outcome. It's sort of being an editor, but I also feel that the way any biography would be told to a certain extent according to the biographers impulses or feelings or, the things that you find or you don't find. There's something of the biographer in that story as well, as much as maybe you try to keep yourself out of it. So I do think of it as a collaboration between Nikki and me. And while I was, putting the book together, I was reading various things about biography, and I listened to a conversation between Imani Perry and Ruth Franklin, both of whom had new biographies out. And one of the things they were talking about was the tyranny of the archive, and the way that you don't always know what you're looking for when you go in, and sometimes you find things that you didn't know you were looking for, but there's always that fear in the back of your mind that you've missed something, and that you're going to find out too late. And so you're sort of at the mercy of what you do find. And
facticity, if that's what you're pursuing.
Facticity.
That need to, which I don't think you go after in a good way. You don't correct the record on anything that she says in the letters and the artwork. Right.
Yeah. I'm not comparing text to see sort of what the differences between the two are and what that might reveal. I'm just putting her voice there to have her tell the story that she was already telling. And I had been doing a lot of reading too about the history of women's biography and autobiography, and the way that not until fairly recently had women been the subject of their own stories, that they had been allowed to sort of tell their own stories. And to be
let me cut you off right there. I'm just kidding.
But the way the genre had been gendered for quite a long time, the idea, first of all, that, that who qualifies for a biography? It was always this sort of romantic notion of the lone genius, who was always white and male. And women were not taught to think of themselves in that sort of individualistic way, that there was a sense of self-denial, right? So thinking of yourself as being worthy of telling your own story, and then having both the power to tell that story, to be able to write it and to publish it in some sort of way, and not have somebody else tell your story as in some way subservient to their own story. And so at some point, I think with second wave feminism, there was a turning point where women were literally writing themselves into history. And so I didn't want Nikki's voice to be lost in that kind of way. I wanted her to be able to tell her own story. And too, in that history, the recent history, there were ways that there was a broadening of what constituted biography and autobiography, the idea of life writing, that it can bring in both different forms of writing those lives, but also the material that sort of makes sense for thinking about a life, not just sort of the traditional, the books somebody has written and the letters they've written, but all this kind of other ancillary stuff. And so it made just so much sense with the book that I wanted to do.
And the decision to stick with her letter art and her letters themselves, as opposed to, one of the neat things is you don't embed a bunch of photographs of the sculptures or the gunshot work and all, and they're described there. And it's like when I recorded with Peter Sheldall last year, when I realized I don't need to look up the things that he's describing. I don't need to see the original art on a screen or something. What he's evoking is what's there. That sense where you let her bring out the tarot garden through the descriptions of what it's like to work there. How much of that, I guess the decision to do that, the decision to just let the art speak as that type of art that it is, and not include, images of, the three-dimensional stuff.
I had certain strictures, I suppose, that I imposed on it. One was that I wanted all the work to be hers. I didn't want anybody else's work in there. And it's 99% true. There's one work where Jean Tinguely's hand is there too. So all the work is hers. All the writing is hers. And the other was that I didn't want to illustrate it in that way with photographs of the work. I wanted to see different ways that I could bring those works in without actually having to show them.
And it's a success. I mean, by my lights, because I think this thing's absolutely phenomenal. And again, this is an artist, as I mentioned in the intro, who I only came across last year-ish in another podcast, of course, because that's the only way I learn anything is by reading for the show. But, creating this sense of her life, it left me wondering, like you were saying, about the different facets that the biographer has to focus on. What do you think she either eluded or just, wasn't something that she gets into that was either a part of her life or you really wanted to hear more about from her perspective?
What are there things?
What are things that you didn't see, I suppose?
There weren't works or texts where she directly talked about her film work and her theater work, it's not as well represented in the book, I think, as I would like, because she did some really fantastic things with theater and with film. And she had been interested in theater from a very early age. I'm trying to think of what other sorts of things. That's such a good question, and I don't have an immediate answer.
You can call later on and say, I was just thinking, and we'll record that too as an extra. But because that's always you bring it up in the introduction, all the things that are missing. What do we never see? And you bring it up in the Ruth Skur, John Aubrey book, which is over there on one of the book carts, which I haven't gotten to only because she hasn't confirmed yet for a podcast, but someday I will sit down
fantastic.
And read.
I kept that book next to me the entire time I put the Nikki book together because I would doubt sometimes whether it was going to work. I thought, this is never going to hold together. And then I would open the Ruth Skur and say, she did it. I can do this.
The book seems to hold generally chronologically. Mm-hmm. Is that the organizing structure? Most
of the works are in there chronologically. There are some that aren't. Yeah. A lot of the text early on, up until the point that she leaves Harry Matthews and becomes a full-time artist, are from her 2 memoirs. And so she wrote those, of course, later in life. One of them was even published posthumously. So she's looking back at her early life. So in that sense, they're not exactly chronologically, but they're describing that portion of her life.
That sequence for her own chronology.
Yeah. And there are a handful of works that have been shuffled around a little bit, but by and large, it
really conveys the arc.
Yeah.
So Peter Sheldell, who I referred to earlier, the only other person I'd seen besides Laura Lindstedt, who in her book, My Friend Natalia, introduces me to Nikki de Saint-Phal, mentions the PS1 exhibition spring of last year, I guess, where he mentions her, Nikki, having 2 chief phases, feminist rage and feminist celebration of womanhood, as far as the, chief phases of her work. You've already got the shoulders kind of going up and laughing, which I can't tell is defensive or not. What's your take on that? Or is this an example of guys not knowing how to discuss women?
I think it's a bit simplistic.
Yeah.
There's so much contiguity in her work. And I think that if you really look at it, especially chronologically, you can see the evolution of it in a way that is really fascinating. We think of the Nanas as being this new, and she does say that she's entering this sort of celebratory portion, but there was pain and trauma throughout her life. But I love looking, especially at that point, where just before she starts making the Nanas, where you can see them coming into being in work that is decidedly different tone-wise and in terms of material than the Nanas, were. Yeah. So I don't think that you can easily sort of slot her entire career into these 2 moments. And one of the other things that was so sort of interesting to discover and to sort of explore in the book was the way that she pairs up sorrow and joy throughout her entire career and in her writing, and the way that those two things are always side by side. So even when you have these very celebratory women, I think that there's always, you know, something else coming around the corner that is the opposite of that. When she made the Skinnies later on in life, she was having problems breathing due to emphysema and working with various kinds of toxic materials.
Literally her artwork killing her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she made these, they're like sort of contours and outlines of figures, and they're still brightly colored as she often made her work in the latter part of her career. But you can, you know, they gave her a sense of breathing. She had gone somewhere where she, to sort of recuperate, and she could breathe again. And she made these sculptures to sort of reflect and celebrate this, you know, that she literally had her breath back. And so you can see, you know, wherever you put these sculptures, you can see through them and beyond, so into the sort of landscape. And I think that is an example of work that has that tension between a kind of, I think for her, a fear that she would not recover, and then a sort of celebration that she has found a way to recover and to keep going.
What's your favorite phase of her work?
I haven't thought about that.
You mentioned a potential favorite piece of hers in the introduction, but is there a period where you think that's, or was there one that grabbed you when you were first discovering her?
I haven't thought about the individual portions of her career, and I don't know. I haven't been to the Tarot Garden.
I was just about to ask, have you been to Tuscany? Because now...
I mean, I think if COVID hadn't happened,
yeah.
I would have. And I think that when I do go, it's going to be a revelation.
Yeah.
I mean, Maxine went, and she said, I can't tell you about it. You just have to go. So that will be something, I'm sure. I love all her work.
Yeah.
I love the way that it progresses and changes, and that she never wanted to repeat herself. She kept moving forward. She's like Gary Panter in that way, I think.
Well, I'll ask about. But talk about, this is an overbroad question coming from a guy. Nikki, as a female artist, she didn't want to participate in all female, exhibitions or showings or anything. And yet she's utterly conscious of her place, quote unquote, in a man's world, in art, in that particular historical moment too. I think she had a line, something about how she's lucky she was attractive, because if she wasn't, they would just say she has a complex or something. What does it all mean? As a guy, what's safe for me to talk about? Who is she, as an emblem of what it means to be both, a woman and an artist, and a mother who decides the art is more important than the kids. I know you've thought about it, because it runs centrally through the book. I just don't know how to elucidate it. Or within the context of the other people you've written about, the other women you've written about.
Wait, so ask me, what do you...
Tell me about women artists. Tell me about women and art and what Nikki is an emblem of. Knowing that she's multivalent, that the meaning is shifting over the course both of her career and the history that she's living through.
What is she emblematic of? I think that maybe that's an individual question. I guess I'm reticent to make her an emblem of something. But she's remarkable in part because she accomplished not only, an incredible body of work, a prolific body of work, but these monumental sculptures and sculpture parks that she, it's almost as though she willed them into being. She did what she needed to do to make them happen. And at the same time, she was a very collaborative artist and loved working with other people. And I think was very, generous with her assistants and the people who worked with her on projects. So I don't want to say that women are a certain way, but she wasn't
a feminine principle of.
She wasn't sort of this genius loner artist. She was not interested in that. She was interested in working with people and making art for people. That was also very important to her. That, as she says, no one was excluded from my work. She wanted people to be engaged with it, to climb on it, to enter it, to walk around it. She made books like her AIDS book, where she had friends who were dying from AIDS, and she wanted to do what she could to help them, to educate. And she, in that book, writes about empathy and about having companionship with people who have AIDS, who are dying from AIDS, who are alone and afraid. And I think that there's so much empathy in her work and so much engagement. And I don't know what that says about her as a woman. Maybe I've gotten off track a little bit.
It's that what's feminine versus what's, human. What's just being a human being in this day and age, and being slotted in as a female artist, or you go into some of the, you select some of the letters that depict some of the tension that goes into, being more successful than her partner. Mm-hmm. And, you better hope this showing doesn't go well, because otherwise that guy's going to leave you because you're going to be more successful than him.
Right. Yeah. And Jean bringing younger women, which must have been hurtful. I mean, she sort of shrugs it off a bit in the letters, but it must have been hurtful. He was not just her, had not just been her lover and her collaborator and partner, but they were so devoted to each other. And I mean, one of the wonderful things I found in the archive, that there was no place for it in the book, was a letter from Jean to Nikki, and she was in Soissy at their place, and he was, I think, somewhere in Switzerland, and he sent her this note. It wasn't really a letter, it was a note. It was just, a few words scribbled on the white backing of a packaging thing and some daubs of paint and whatnot, and it was stamped and addressed to her, and I flip it over, and it's a cheese grater. He wrote it on the back of the packaging of a cheese grater. Yeah. And it's looked like a cheap sort of dollar store cheese grater. And he had mailed it. The cheese grater was still in the bubble packaging.
Yeah.
And he hadn't put it in a package and mailed it. And she didn't open it. So she didn't need a cheese grater. He mailed her the thing itself. And I just thought, this is, there's no real note written on it. But it seemed so expressive of the kind of relationship where somebody so well, it just felt like the ultimate love letter,
We'll tell your husband. This is right before Valentine's Day that we're recording this.
Women love cheese graters. I think I'm not really answering your question. I don't think she wanted to be a woman artist. Yeah. She wanted to be an artist, right. And she wanted to do it on her own terms. And it was a very difficult thing to do. In 1960, when she separated from Harry and she left her family for a short time and devoted herself full-time to being an artist. And I think a lot of the women that she encountered, she mentioned Joan Mitchell, they didn't have families. They didn't have this sort of other side of things. And you hear about male artists all the time leaving their families, and it's not such a big deal. And she did it, and it was a big deal.
Oh,
and it was a big deal to her.
Yeah.
But it's what she needed to do to be an artist. And as she says, she spent the rest of her life completely devoted to her work to make up for what she had done. And she never forgot, I think, that feeling of having left them for a time.
That if you're going to leave them, you may as well commit to the thing you're leaving them for. It puts me in mind of recording with Celia Paul 2 years ago. She was with Lucian Freud and family art, the tension of that, and being a woman artist who knows that any description of her will be in her own right. She joked that was going to be the title of her memoir because everyone would say Celia Paul, an artist in her own right, in addition to being Lucian Freud's muse once upon a time. She knew she would never escape that definition, but went off to just, pursue the art as best she could.
Right, that's the idea of women not being the subject of their own stories, right? Yeah. She's going to be subsumed under Freud's, like an asterisk, under Freud's story. But
that's why her next book is about Gwen John. So that's going to be a hoot. So I'm hoping to get her back on for that, but we'll see. What came first with the pieces that you're using in here, the ones that are drawn writing? The writing or the drawing, or were they done, by Nikki in process? Did she sketch these things out? Was she writing them? Some of them you include the notes and the writing for them, but, did the writing precede the drawing significantly?
I think it depends on the work.
Yeah.
She did keep in the explicitly diaristic works, she was writing these things down and then pulling from those written pieces to make the artwork. Mm-hmm. Especially the California Diary pieces toward the end that she made in 1994. They're very much about this sort of day to day and what she was doing. But I think it just depends on the work.
Yeah.
I think she was writing more later in life than she was toward the beginning.
And the thing that Laura Lindstedt, the author who turned me on to Nikki, asks, from a fictitious perspective of a graphologist, do you draw any conclusions about Nikki's handwriting style? This is the sort of, you're going to love Laura's book, but this is the sort of thing that, she...
That's the thing I love about her. I mean, about her handwriting, but the piece that I mentioned in my foreword that's perhaps my favorite in the book is just that. It's one side of the drawing one side of the work has drawings of animals, and the other side has her lettering, and she's tried out all these different sort of typographies in her own hand, and they all look different, and the animals and the letters relate to one another. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at that and thinking that it was almost like a sort of, Rosetta Stone to understanding her work, that she, thought in pictures and she drew in letters, that it was all a piece.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about comics shortly, because that's there are pieces that are in the book that I had this technically is a comic, even if it's just text, it's still working in a sequential way graphically. And do you see, though, a progression in the graphic written work of hers? Or do you see that, again, sort of ebbing and flowing? Was there a progression within that particular type of art for her?
Do you mean of the ones that are sequential in that way?
Oh, no, just all the sorts of pieces you pick in the book. Just this entire phase or type of her art, as opposed to the sculptures and everything else. With the drawing, writing.
Oh.
Do you see a change or progression in her career? Like from the early stuff to the diaries, how it changes and progresses. Or does it change and progress?
Of the works on paper.
Yes. Which is an easy way of saying the thing I was convolutedly saying. But that's because I'm an art moron, as we've established.
She made them throughout. So the earliest one in the book, the first one in the book, I should say, it's not necessarily the earliest, is a book called My Love from 1970 that I've moved forward a little bit in the chronology. But it's a words and pictures on each page and it tells a story. It was a small book that she made. And she was still doing that, in later on in the 70s and then into the 80s and the 90s. So she really stuck with that. I think that was a very useful way for her to tell a story, and express an idea. I mean, in all these, there are both real letters and these sort of, I've been calling them art letters. They're letters that were never
Yeah, I
send.
wondered about those. Yeah.
I think she made them for a catalog. To my knowledge, they only ever appeared in this German catalog for an exhibition. I think it was 93 or 94. But they're addressed to people, and they describe certain portions of her life where she's writing, for instance, to Pontus Hulten about her shooting paintings. And so she described, they were so useful because she describes the entire process, the life of these shooting paintings. But they were never meant to be sent. They were always artworks, but they're primarily text artworks. They're so interesting.
Is there something you would ask her?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I get the feeling you were not channeling, but listening to her throughout this. But is there something that you feel like, God damn it, I wish I could ask her? Because again, I don't think it's about the facts, but you may prove me wrong.
I can't think of one thing, but I would have loved to have sat down and listened to her. At the end of the PS1 show, there was a film, and it sort of goes through the chronology of a portion of her career, and she narrates it. And it's later in life, because her voice has gotten kind of husky and a little gravelly. It's wonderful. The sound of her voice is wonderful. But it's so great listening to her talk about it, because she remembers it so well, but she can talk about what she was doing in that work, and then she has such a sense of humor about it. And so I would have, just to sit and listen to her talk about things, I think would have been wonderful.
Now you know why I do this every weekend. So, tell me about your art history, your history with art. Tell me who you are.
I grew up in North Texas, in Denton, and my mother worked in Fort Worth, just a couple blocks from the area of town where the museums are, the art museums. So I grew up going to the Kimball, which is one of the best small art museums, I think, in the country. And it has beautiful architecture by Louis Kahn, these great barrel vaults, series of barrel vaults, all in concrete. So it was like a sort of really wonderful tomb feeling inside. But they get great shows there. So we saw, the Barnes collection came there, and I remember a show of Jane art, just a very big mix of art. And we had books in the house, so we had some art books. But I never really realized that I could pursue art history, which is sort of funny. And then halfway through college, I took my first art history class, and it was a revelation.
Yeah.
And I took as many classes as I could over the last 2 years and minored in it. And
where'd you go to school?
I went to school at Trinity University in San Antonio. And I had a couple of very good art history professors there. And their focus was not on theory, but on primary documents. And, for instance, comparing primary documents. And that's really stuck with me. And I love the research, and I love going to archives. And then I wasn't sure what I was going to do after college. And a friend had moved up to New York, and I came to visit him. And we went to the Met. I think it was maybe January, and it was snowing. And I thought, why am I anywhere else but here? And I moved up shortly after, and then went to graduate school at Columbia for art history and got my master's. It wasn't a great experience. It's a very theory-heavy department, and I hadn't read any theory, and I felt lost most of the time.
Even if you had read theory, you'd have been lost.
I still would have been lost, no doubt. And I think what I picked up there has sort of come back to me over time. I have a greater understanding of it. But it was a very confusing experience. Mm-hmm. And then I started working at Art Forum shortly after, and that was sort of my entree into the New York art world.
Yeah.
And then everything after that.
Yeah. Tell me about Gary Panter. And tell me about comics in your life.
Oh, gosh. I never read comics as a kid. I got into them as an adult.
Well, with you being a girl, that's our standard.
I didn't know anybody that read comics. I read some Tank Girl in college, and that was about it. And then my husband, who we weren't married at the time, he got back into comics. He had read them as a kid, and so that's when I started reading them. And I found a copy of Jimbo on the shelf at Art Forum. And
Seduction of the Innocent. There.
I had never seen anything like it. It was art, it was literature, it was comics, it was all three and sort of its own thing at the same time. And were you asking me about Jimbo specifically, or
about
comics
Panter,
in general?
about comics and how they intersect with your understanding of art?
I never had a plan.
Yeah.
I never really
You think
knew.
I'm meant to be doing this? So I go.
I never really thought about what I was going to be doing. I knew what I liked. But I talked to these kids coming out of college now and who are in their 20s and so on, and they seem so focused, and I never felt that. So I feel like I just have stumbled from one thing to another, discovering along the way that, oh, this is my thing. And so, I had that Jimbo comic for a while, and then Dan Nadell was doing Picture Box. And the things that he was publishing were the sorts of things that I didn't know I was looking for. But once I saw it, it just felt right. Like I understood it and I could read it and feel it. And Gary was a part of that. I mean, certainly Gary is very important to Dan and was important to Picture Box. And then Dan published the big 2-volume monograph, and it was...
That's right over there. You can see the GAR.
Yeah. What a stunning book that is.
It's amazing.
With one of the books being devoted to his sketchbooks, where just... I mean, you could spend a lifetime looking at that alone. We're
talking about the Gary Panter slipcased edition, by the way, which I'll include a picture of in the show notes for this one, because it's something I'm really proud of owning. So.
He's an astonishing artist.
Yeah. And when you only know him from the comics, from these very punk rock, raw era comics, it's one of those revelations of, oh, yeah, no, he's just keeps creating in every form that's out there.
Yeah,
so.
He's done, I mean, like Nicky, he's done a multitude of forms. He is not interested in retreading old material. So I was so glad that we got to reprint Jimbo, because I don't think it was necessarily something that he was burning to do, but that book was so significant to me. Yeah. It was sort of the beginning of my realization of all this other stuff that was out there that was very much my thing, and I hadn't known it. So to be able to reprint that book was just, it was, a dream job.
Yeah.
And working with Gary on it, it was really fun. He's such a fun guy.
It's one of the disappointments when he told me, I just don't want to do an interview with you, Gil. It's not you. I've just been talking too much to Nicole, and I'm just going to put off interviews for a while. I'm like, I understand.
Is it my fault that he said that?
Yes, all your fault. Well, he did mention doing a bunch of sessions with you, like week after week, and so he felt kind of talked out at that point. But, we would hang out and I would listen to him talk. Yeah. But he's been interviewed a lot over the years, and I think he's been written about. That's been part of it. I think he just doesn't need this experience on top of everything else he's had. Writing the afterword for that book was important too, because it was, partly writing an essay about him that I had never read anywhere and kind of always wanted to, that he's not written about critically in the way that he ought to be. Yeah. I mean, he's such a great talker, and so I think that people are always excited about talking to him, but he really deserves a critical body of work that he's not gotten. What do you think that is? Partly the comics, what do you think that is? I do think it's partly the comics, and the way that comics, and particularly, a certain kind of comics, they've not entered into more mainstream reading. And so he's still very marginalized.
I think, too, that he doesn't seek it out. And I think especially, today, you have to be your own, not just be your own advocate, you really have to push, social media and all this sort of your own publicity machine. You are your own marketing, and it's exhausting, and who at his age would want to do that?
No, that's why I like the fact that he just posts those milk carton plastic tabs that he's been collecting and, just sculpting into interesting forms. I'm like, that's all I need to see. I don't need, the Gary Panter Instagram story of him talking about his dinner or something like that. But
the idea that artists can't just be artists, writers can't just be writers, that they have to be, publicity people too, I think is a real shame.
So besides Jimbo and this book, which both come off as dream projects of yours.
They are.
Yeah. Other dreams in the pipeline? Or do you feel like, holy crap, I've managed to pull off the two things I really wanted to do, besides have a family and all the personal life stuff?
I am working some other things, but I'm not sure I can...
Don't jinx anything.
I'm not sure I can say
No, but I'm just glad to know that there are other dream projects.
There are.
As opposed to, I have to do X, Y, and Z.
Definitely dream projects coming up.
Bigger work about female artists or about the role of women in art? I just wonder, given this book and your recent pieces in the New York Review of Books, they sort of intertwine.
They do.
Yeah. What with them being about girls and stuff.
And I was working on my essay for the New York Review about Nathalie Lauger roughly at the same time I was putting parts of this book together, and there was so much overlap. And so much of the reading that I had done while making the Nikki book and the sort of broader landscape of autobiography and women's experiences, and fed into the Leger. There was a lot in common there. I don't know that, at least in the foreseeable future, that I would do a book.
As I like to say, the last 2 years have taught us that the words foreseeable future are not a thing. As we were talking about things that we were doing in February 2020, thinking the world was perfectly fine.
Right. I like the deep dive. Yeah. I like the specificity. So I think in terms of monographs rather than the sort of a broader picture. So for now,
yeah,
I think that's...
I again, no jinxing and no, giving away ideas that somebody might decide, I'm going to be the one to do this instead. That's one of the interesting things. I think it was the Publisher's Weekly review of your book that, says instead of being a monograph, as we mentioned earlier, you don't intrude. Your hand is over the entire book, but there's no, what she meant here was X, Y, and Z, mm-hmm. Or this happens to coincide with, you really let the artist speak for herself, mm-hmm. which I don't think I'd encountered previously, and was really kind of taken by that idea that, the degree of trust you have to have as a reader, both with the artist and with the person who's assembled this all, what pieces are there, what the sequence is, and how it all works. Mm-hmm. So it's a heck of an achievement. The question I have, which comes on page 243, according to my notes, the French conceal and the Americans reveal as far as emotions go. Is that I think that was a concern. You can go look it up and make sure. In one of the letters, somebody points out...
oh, right.
Yeah. None of which is to say you agree with anything that's in the text.
The French are terrified to appear abnormal in any way. Americans, I think, have the advantage of being curious about themselves.
And then I think it explicitly says...
The French are brought up to conceal emotion, the Americans to reveal emotion. Well, she's so often thought of as a French artist, but she was raised in the United States. She spent her first 3 years in France, but then, up until the point that she and Harry moved to France after they were married, she lived in the United States, and those are formative years. And she's very much, I think, both, I suppose, European and American. And she says, maybe more than once, that she doesn't really think of herself as being either. But I think in the sort of monumentality and the individual, in the sort of in the vision of her work, there's something very American about it. And certainly the idea of revealing, which I think is a rather true observation about Americans. You know, we smile a lot. We talk about ourselves.
Ad nauseum. I mean, I do all the time, but usually to myself. But do you think she regretted not having real art training?
No.
Yeah, as she mentions, like trying once and realizing this is just because she's already progressed too far in what she's doing. But
she had a vision. She had her own vision, and she found a way to express it in a manner that is completely unique to her. And I don't see what art training
that
could have made better or easier in that expression.
Was it Jean who says that, you know, technique is secondary? It's the vision.
It's nothing, you can learn it. Yeah, I love that.
You know, which I've been trying to prove for a couple of decades now. But, so tell me about seeing art in the pandemic.
I didn't see any art.
Yeah. Like, what's that been like? Having 2 years of
I think the first
seclusion
show we saw was the Nikki show at PS1. We went for the press preview and took the whole family and took the kids, and it was a great show for the kids. I mean, my daughter she was 7 at the time, and she just dragged me around from one thing to another. And they had seen it at home because I had been working on the book for so long.
Was there anything, by the way, that your husband had oh my God, not another Nikki thing? I ask every author, regardless of gender, that
he loved
did your
it
partner
too.
freak
I mean,
out?
it was so great to see her stuff in person, and it's so open and I suppose accessible. It's made for people to engage with. So it was wonderful. I think that was the first show. I haven't seen much. I did make it last summer to Chicago and saw the Joseph Yoakum there, which is at is it at MoMA now? It's in New York now.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of, I've seen it come up in New Yorker or something as, you know,
that was a great show.
Yeah.
And then I wandered around the collection at the Art Institute and just got very emotional because I hadn't seen a lot of art and I hadn't realized how much I missed it. And so I'm walking around for a couple hours in the collection, literally feeling like I'm being filled up.
Yeah. Was there a particular one that just put you over the top? And the Art Institute's wonderful. I mean,
my gosh, the collection is room to room. You're just in awe, like, oh my gosh, here's a Caillebotte and here's a Seurat. And
I wrote my first short story in 20 years after my first Art Institute visit. I was completely flummoxed by a Charles Ray sculpture, which Peter Sheldall refers to in this week's New Yorker, and it had one of those. I was so flummoxed by the idea of a guy spending 10 years reproducing a fallen tree in fiberglass that I actually went back to my hotel room and started writing. Mm-hmm. But was there something that the hoppers or anything else that was just, this got you crying?
There was one, I can't now remember who it is. It may have been Whistler. It was a night landscape, and it was so subtly painted with, what was in the sky? I can't even quite remember the detail. And it just was so perfect and quiet and beautiful. And
that was it.
I felt a little overcome. I mean, I love seeing art, and I did not realize how much I missed it.
Have you been to the relocated Frick yet or not?
No.
I haven't gone yet because I'm afraid to go anywhere. I don't travel. Thank you for coming to my house for this one.
You should go.
Yeah. It's the going into the city and getting over the whole, psychosis thing. There was a while that I was good with it and went in to do a couple of shows, and then Omicron hit, and I just went into absolute seclusion and hiding, or agoraphobia, depending on how you want to define it. But yeah, going to the former Whitney, I guess, and I did go to the new Whitney and see the Jasper Johns a couple of a couple of months ago, I guess. I think it's finishing this weekend. So, you have a couple hours if you want to race over there.
I did go see the Etel Adnan exhibition at the Guggenheim not too long ago. And I'm so glad I saw that. Her paintings are just stunning. Yeah. I mean, so simple and peaceful and so much color. I would love to have those in my house.
Are there artists you would want to curate a show for? Not that you curate, but if someone said, we'd love you to organize, besides Nikki, of course, we'd love you to organize a showing. And we could say 20th, 21st century, it doesn't have to be, Rembrandt,
I'm sure there is, but I can't think of it.
Which is a way of asking, who's your favorite artist?
I don't have a favorite artist. Yeah. There are too many wonderful ones. Mm-hmm. And I get something different from each one of them. And I have maybe I suppose most people do, very wide tastes. Yeah.
Do you draw or paint?
No.
Have you thought about it? I started last year at 50.
No.
I'm just saying.
I can't. I'm not.
No, you can. Because if I
could do it badly.
No, if I showed you the first ones from 1 year ago, 2 weeks back, they would look like a guy with traumatic brain injury, figuring out how to hold a pencil and against a piece of paper. And within like 3 or 4 weeks, those trees out through that window, they're there. It only took a couple of weeks of like learning to look at something and draw. I had no skill whatsoever in this beforehand. So
that's what my husband has done over the last several years.
I'm telling you.
Every night.
That's the thing. It was the daily practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, ignore your kids, pull a Nikki, and just say, I don't need kids. I'm going to go make art.
I don't think I have. It's the daily practice I'm not good at.
That's the toughest thing with any as I've discovered, any form. Just putting in the time and actually doing something regularly. That's why I do the daily postcard thing now also.
Mm-hmm.
I have all the cards sitting over there in that box. I just pull one and write to somebody. Usually it's something weird and gnomic that, will make no sense to them. And I have to figure out who I'm going to address it to afterwards because I don't want anyone to get freaked out who receives it. But I'll send you
mail
something.
art?
No, it's all text, but it's just strange. Some of the stuff is just weird observations I came up with first thing in the morning and write it down and then figure, I gotta send this to someone, but I don't want it to be someone who's going to call the cops because they're worried about me. So, have to go through the address book afterwards.
Postcards are fun because the limitation of space makes you, you've got to be pretty creative about what you say. And I think the less you say, the more fun it is.
Yeah.
It's great to get postcards.
Yeah, and that's part of my thing. I love receiving from people, so I just decided every single day I'm going to send a card to somebody.
That's nice.
Except for Sundays, of course. But yeah, it's a weird trip. And then getting things back in the mail and realizing that, somebody out there is actually thinking of you and wrote something. Not necessarily to you. They may have addressed it afterwards like I do, but that's neither here nor there. But what do you feel you learned over the course of the book? Besides the aspects of Nikki's life, how do you feel you're different as a human being, knowing that the pandemic was part of this whole process? But
I think having faith in the form of the book has made me more confident about, that these sorts of things can work and that they can be successful. And I don't think you can do this with any artist. Yeah. And I'm still a fan of traditional biographies.
Did it change your whole notion of a biography?
It's expanded my notion of a biography. And I was going to say the best way, but it's not necessarily the best way, but the different ways that you can tell the story of a person's life. So I think I have that expanded view of what a book can be and the story of a person's life can look like is going to change the way that I approach things in the future. I don't know that I can say exactly how yet.
You won't know until you're
But I don't think things need to look the way that they've always looked. That they don't need to be done the way that they've always been done.
And was Siglio the perfect publisher for this?
She was the perfect publisher.
Is that pronounced correctly, by the way?
Siglio.
Oh, good. Okay.
And, Lisa had faith in the project from the very beginning. She understood it instantly, and she never questioned the methodology, the form. I remember I was, not writing critically about Nikki's work, because obviously I have opinions about her work and her career and the way the different parts of it sort of fit together. So, but not voicing those opinions was sort of difficult for me. And I had a draft of, so the foreword and the afterword used to be just one long text. And I had a draft where I think I had started to sort of doubt that it was going to work. And so I made a timeline of her life. And I put in sentences that were very matter of fact, very factual. Nikki and Harry get married on this date. And then I interlaced, I'm not quite sure how to describe them. Sometimes quotations, sort of little interesting facts and things that people said sort of in between those. And I thought about maybe doing them in different colors to sort of give the reader an opportunity to literally see the chronology of her life, but to keep it a little bit different. And I sent it to Lisa, and she said, "You're doing exactly the thing you didn't want to do." Mm-hmm. And that's all she had to say. And I knew instantly what she meant and that she was totally right. And I stripped out the chronology and I took pieces from what I had left and made the second half of the text in the book. And so she understood it. I mean, the ethos of Siglio, Lisa is Siglio. It's a one-woman operation. And the ethos is so in keeping with what this book is.
She said that in an interview with Stephen Heller recently. She was talking about the book, and it was one of those describing how you explain the book to her. She was like, well, obviously we have to do this book. This is exactly what the press is here for, because it doesn't make, conventional sense, I guess. Yeah, I don't mean it in a bad way. Just you could go to another publisher with this idea as opposed to.
It wouldn't have been this book with another publisher. She usually says that if she can picture a book being published by another publisher, it's not a Siglio book.
Yes, that's what I mean, which is a much better way of putting it.
And I mean, I can't see anybody else doing this book exactly the way that I wanted to, with as much, care and attention. And I mean, it's a huge book. It's 4-color throughout.
How'd you feel when you actually got it out of the box?
Oh my gosh, that it's real. I mean,
in comparison with having children, does this slot into that sort of more painful, less pain? No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, that sense of holy crap, I did this, and the publisher did this, and we managed to make
we did it, yeah, and it's beautiful, and it's exactly what I wanted it to be. I mean, you can sort of always keep working on something and keep perfecting it and always perfecting it. At some point, you just have to let it go. So, but I feel immensely satisfied with the way the book came out. It's exactly what I wanted.
And you carry the whole sweep of her, we'll say her career. The life gets alluded to the early days, but yeah, when you talk about that timeline, there were moments where I was, mentally trying to construct when would this have been exactly, and you keep going a few more pages and it becomes clear that, okay, yeah, this is following that. This is around the era this took place, just from a couple of key references that are there, or, what the art looks like. So,
I mean, as with an artwork, the person who's looking at it has to participate in it. Yeah. There's thinking and there's looking and there's reflection. And that's the same with this book. Things are not spelled out. There are hints as to when certain pieces were made, or what the time periods are when she's talking about things. But the reader has to be involved in it and participate in it in the way that they would be with her actual artworks. In sort of the three-dimensional sculptures that she made. The idea of walking around it and climbing into it and climbing onto it. It's the same sort of feeling here that you have to, as a reader, every page is meant to be read from cover to cover, and you've got to spend some time with it and have faith in it, and keep reading. And I think that it does come together.
It does. You win. You did a great job. I'm astonished and was worried in advance. I'm like, I don't know enough about art. Am I going to be completely lost in this book? And you organized. She tells the story. It works really well as far as I'm concerned. Last question: who you're reading? Which I know I should have warned you was coming, because people hate drawing a blank over that question. But
I'm reading Lucille Clifton's memoir that New York Review Books published, I think, last November. It's called Generations, very slim volume, but it's just incredible. And it's funny, it is very much in line with this book and with the way that I think about, narrative and talking about one's own life. It's she writes them in these sort of discrete chapters where things are being told to her about her family by her father. And it's very... It has a lot to do with memory, particularly, I think, a kind of passing down of family history orally, where there are gaps and there are things that people don't know, but there's such a strong sense of who her family is and who the individuals in her family were. And it's beautiful. And it reminds me so much of some of the other books that I was reading sort of in anticipation of the Nikki book, and while I was putting it together, like Natalie Sarraud's memoir of her childhood. I'm
blanking because you cite like three of them in the first couple of paragraphs of the introduction. I'm trying to visualize them too.
Saidiya Hartman's book, which that was another one that blew me out of the water. I mean, that is one of the most significant books to be published, I think, in, certainly this century. I mean, what a fantastic way of bringing people back into the world, and people who were never given the opportunity to record their own stories, much less publish them. And she's reconstituting them in the only way that she can. And I think that's just one of the most fantastic books that I've read in a very long time.
I won't ask next projects, although is there anything you're working on short form, like New York Review or anything you can talk about that you're working?
I am doing some things for the New York Review, but
don't talk about it.
I will mention it.
I guess final one. Letting the book go. Yeah, I mean, you talk about how great it was, seeing it in print, but as you said, there's a moment where you have to finish. How did it feel to know you were done, I guess? And were you able to decompress from Nikki for a while?
I'm not sure I quite feel like it's done yet. I mean, the book comes out...
It'll be out when this episode airs.
Okay, well, yeah. a week from now. So I still have, events to do around it. So I don't feel quite like it's in the rearview mirror just yet, but ready to keep going. I mean, there's so many things that I want to be working on, so I love getting to the next new thing. And I've already started working on the next thing, and it's sort of all I want to spend my time on. Awesome. I'm in the wonderful research phase, which is my favorite.
You nerd. Which is why I love you and why I'm glad you're on the show. So, Nicole, thanks so much for coming on. And next book, or, whenever the hell we can manage to get together and talk again, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Gil.
And that was Nicole Rudick. Her new book is What Is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined, an autobiography of Nikki de Sanfal from Siglio Press, and it is available wherever you get good books, or really good books. Besides being a great exploration of an artist's life, it is, as we talked about, flat out gorgeous to look at. So go check this book out. It is truly a wonder. You should also pick up New York Review Comics' reissue of Gary Panter's Jimbo, for which Nicole wrote the afterword. Her stuff's been appearing lately in New York Review of Books, and you can keep up with her through her site, NicoleRudick.com, and on Twitter, where she goes by Nicole Rudick, all one word, and on Instagram, where she's Nicole_Rudick. In all those cases, it is NicoleRudick. And I'll have links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Just let them know there's this guy just recording these great conversations with creative folks every single week. Every single week. Eventually I'll take a week off, but, we'll see. You can also tell me what you like and don't like about the show. Just fill me in on what music you want to hear me talk about, or TV show, or book or movie or comic or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. Or just call or let me know who you want to hear me record with. They can do that by sending me an email, postcard, letter. I send postcards every single day now. It's my 2022 thing. If it's a day with U.S. mail, I will send out one postcard. Sometimes I write them without knowing who they're going to and figure it out afterwards, like I did this morning. Other times they are directly set up for an individual. Anyway, you can do it that way, or you can leave a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me, and they're all awkward, trust me. Messages can only be 3 minutes long, so if you're going to go real long, plan for that and call back and leave the second half of the message. And let me know if it's cool to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. I would never do that without the speaker's permission, but if you've got something you want listeners to hear, just leave me a message and let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. My day job treats me just fine. I don't have an awful lot of expenses for the show anymore. So if you have money or other resources to spare, I hope you'll give it to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato Go, and other crowdfunding platforms. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, you can look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Project Blue Dot, which is trying to raise election funds, funds for organizing for elections for Democrats in traditionally Republican zones. I'm going to have a podcast about that sometime in the next couple of months. There are also freedom funds and other things you can contribute to. But my point is, if you have some money to spare, there are a lot of ways to help try to build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.